you totally improve your memory. So I will tell you how it's working, and then I totally believe that you will be able to use that in your real life, and especially preparing for various competitions and getting to learn a lot of information. So let me just quickly introduce myself, because probably we haven't met. So I'm a psychophysiologist, which means that I'm studying cognitive functions such as memory and attention, which are the most interesting for me cognitive functions. But I also focus on physiological viewpoint using some brain visualization methods in the very way of investigating memory and attention. So there's also a lot of stuff like where I graduated from, where I studied, where I had internships. So I'm pretty sure that as people read so much faster than I hear, I'm pretty sure you've already read all that. So I will just say that I feel like it's a kind of a proper introduction, so we can move on. And also, you can see the book right behind me, and you've also seen this on the title slide. This is a cover of my book on memory improvement, and all the other pictures in the presentation will also be some pictures, some frames from this very book. So I try to translate most of it into English, but I also translated all the available information on the slides. But if you see the picture with some built-in text in some unknown language, that's an Easter egg for Russian-speaking students, and that's just it. So moving on to memory. Actually, I have a question for you. And I would, before introducing the very definition of memory, I would really love to ask you, what do you think memory is all about? Like, what functions memory is responsible of? Maybe in a more prosaic way, why do we really need memory? Maybe it's going to be fine just to live without memory. Who knows? Probably those people aren't listening to this lecture right now. So I would greatly appreciate if you just type in the chat your possible ideas, like what do we need memory for? Like, what's memory's functions? Why do we need it? What do we use memory for? And so on, like all those possible ideas why memory is needed. Oh, cool, finally, there's a slight delay, so I was just like repeating that, and now I've seen all your answers, and that's great. So I see the idea that memory is both the index and the retrieving process, like the storage. I really like the organic computer metaphor. The ability to keep and save our experience somewhere in the brain. Yeah, I would also totally agree with that. There's one more important point here. So we do save information, but what else we use memory for? Like not only for saving information, right? We also have to do something with that. So how would you probably describe it? So yeah, we're saving information. That's great. We've saved it. We're cool. But like, what then? What are we doing then? So we keep the experience. We'll somehow use our memory as an organic computer, but like, what's then? And especially, what's the main dysfunction of the memory? I'm not talking about any diagnosis here. It's just about the disruption, like how do we call disruption in the working of the memory? Okay, so I see a comment about ability to select and eliminate experiences that I've seen or hear. About selection, it's what attention does. So of course, memory is super interconnected with attention. And actually, we can't remember anything if we're not getting enough attention to this point, and vice versa. If we're getting attention, we can remember something. But in general, or once we're talking about remembering something, we're just operating with all the information that we've already paid our attention to. So I will wait for like just like 30 seconds in case there's some more messages in the chat that for some reason I haven't seen yet. But actually, once we're talking about memory and its definition, it's really funny that we pretty well intuitively understand what we need memory for and how memory operates. So the main idea here, yeah, great, I've just seen it, that we can act upon stored data. I totally agree with you here. So once we're talking about memory, there are several important functions. So what do we need memory for? So firstly, we need memory to save information. That's pretty clear. I mean, we've just started with that. It's the most obvious function of memory. Another point here is that we need memory to consolidate information. Consolidation is a pretty tricky process inside of saving information. We'll get a little bit more into detail of consolidation later when we'll talk about different types of memory. So for now on, you have this little exercise of remembering the word consolidation as a part of memory function. And also, as we've just mentioned, we use memory to recall the information. There's no use of saving information if you can't use it, if you can't recall it. And also, it's really pretty important to keep in mind that once we're talking about memory, the disruption in memory functioning could be on these different levels. So some people may have problems with saving information, but they can absolutely easily recall the information they want to recall. And on the other side, there are some people who have no problems with saving information, but they do have problems with bringing it up and with recalling it. And last but not least, for sure, memory function, one of memory functions is the ability to forget. It's a little counterintuitive because the whole idea of memory is of saving and recalling information. So how is forgetting included in memory? But the whole idea here is about attention. So we pay attention to different things, and probably if you have focused on something and remembered it, but decided that probably we don't need it anymore, we can forget this information. And the whole process of forgetting may be annoying sometimes, especially once we forget the information that we didn't want to forget. But usually we do forget things if we didn't really pay enough attention to remember it. So in general, that's how memory operates. And that's where we may have problems on saving part and on recalling part. And based on that, I would really love to tell you about two super interesting cases that we have in psychology. So the first case is the case of Solomon Cheryshev. You can guess he was Russian by his name because it's really pretty hard to pronounce it in English. So the whole idea of Cheryshev is really funny because this is a guy who literally remembered everything, like literally everything that ever happened to him. And why we love Cheryshevsky's case so much is because here you can see Alexander Luria. He's a super famous neuropsychologist. So let me just quickly ask you, if I'm telling you something about physiology experiments and that Russian guy who experimented on dogs and on their saliva, so what was the surname of this guy? Just pop it up in the chat. Like, Russian physiologist experimented on dogs, studied reflexes, studied learning. So what was the surname of that guy? Yeah, that's a right guess, for sure. Yeah, that's Pavlov. And what is really nice about that, like you all know him, even though you come from different backgrounds and from different countries. I mean, the guy won the Nobel Prize. We kind of know him. So as Pavlov is a very famous Russian physiologist, so Luria, you can see here on the slide, is a pretty famous internationally neuropsychologist. So the whole idea of Cheryshev, who had a condition called hypomnesia, meaning he literally remembered everything. And the idea and the fact that he was studied for 20-something years by Alexander Luria really means something. So we have one of the best neuropsychologists in the world studying a really tricky case of keeping information in the memory. That's something. So actually what is really funny about Cheryshev is that after 20-something years, Luria gave up. So his original idea, once he met Cheryshev, was that probably Luria would continue giving Cheryshev more and more memory tests, and in the end, he will find that moment when Cheryshev fails. But that didn't happen. So what really happened that Luria gave Cheryshev more and more memory tests, and he passed all of them, like all of them. He made some minor mistakes, but it was pretty soon found out that those mistakes he made, not because there was a problem with saving information, but because there was some disruption in getting up from recalling this information from the memory. So this very case actually inspires us and proves that we don't have limited capacity for our memory. On the contrary, it's unlimited. So if you're studying more and more information, there's no way you have no space. I mean, in this case, this computer metaphor is not really working because every computer has its limits. But once we're talking about our brain and our memory storage, it's unlimited. We can save as many information as we want. We won't run out of space. So that's why this case of Cheryshev and his hypomnesia is extremely inspirational. It shows us that actually we have unlimited memory capacity, so we can use it. On the other hand, if we're talking about Cheryshev, we can say he had almost no problems with saving information and no problems with recalling information. But on the contrary, sometimes people do have problems with that. And those cases are called amnesias. So once we're talking about amnesias, there's one super important person here whose name is patient HM. We didn't made clear his real name for a pretty long time, because just imagine how would all the students, all the psychology students and neurophysiology students react if they get to know the real name of the patient. I mean, they would just run to his house with all those memory tests and wouldn't stop until he's completely done. So for a pretty long time, patient HM was known in all the scientific articles as patient HM. And what's pretty surprising about him is that he couldn't remember anything. So as Cheryshev had no problems with remembering and recalling, with saving information and just finding it back, patient HM had real problems with both of these processes. So how happened so? I mean, he looks pretty handsome, I would say. So what we know about patient HM? It all started when he suffered from epilepsy seizures in childhood, and that became so annoying that he agreed for an experimental operation. So now we usually cure epilepsy with some drugs, and we're pretty good at it. But patient HM was living in the late 50s. So in that case, we had no such drugs. So he was offered to remove the part of his brain that caused those epileptic seizures. And it happened so that his seizure was located in the part of the brain called hippocampus. So this is hippocampus. If we translate it from the Greek, it's a horse. So it's really pretty funny here that we have this funny idea that brain structures are sometimes named after animals. So what happened with patient HM? His hippocampus, this part of his brain, was just removed in order to prevent him from having even more epileptic seizures. But what happened next? The very day after the operation, it turned out that he couldn't remember any kind of new information, like at all. He could save the information for a pretty short period of time, but after that, he completely lost it. On the other hand, which is really interesting, he totally could remember all the information that he saved before the operation. So patient HM remembered his childhood. He remembered his school friends, but he totally couldn't remember like anything new. So patient HM in his case was really grounding in the very idea that we found out that hippocampus, this brain structure, is really important for remembering information and for keeping that in our memory. So also, once we're talking about this patient HM, for sure, this is a case of amnesia. And once we're talking about amnesias, we have different amnesia types based on the information loss. So in patient HM case, there was an event. It was an operation of removing hippocampus. And he kept in his memory what was before the operation, but he couldn't save any information after the operation. And that's what we called anterograde amnesia, because a person's total remembers what was before, but he can't remember anything new. And yeah, so on the other hand, if it's vice versa, so the person can't remember anything that was before, but can totally fully operate his memory right now, it's retrograde amnesia. And both amnesias seems like they inspire a lot of Hollywood script writers, because almost in every Hollywood movie, when you have this plot based on some memory problems, it's mostly amnesia. And it's really funny that amnesias are really often showed in Hollywood films, not as they are in real life, but well, that's a good plot twist. So moving on, we've discussed that there are people who have like no problems with memory, saving, and recalling, as that was in the case of Solomon Cheryshev. We've discussed that on the other pole, we have patient HM who can't remember anything new after the operation. So let's talk about normal people, like how it operates in our case. So yeah, actually about the book, I will mention that in the very end. Yeah, that's a really great one. So how memory works in our real life, like normal people like us. It's really important here that we have different types of memory depending on the time, like for how long do we keep the information in the memory. So we have sensory memory, which is sometimes called ultra-short memory. We have short-term memory and we have long-term memory. I totally believe that you've heard at least once in your life, or even more times, about short-term memory and long-term memory. So put the plus in the chat if you've ever heard those terms. I'm pretty sure you've all heard about it. So the tricky thing here is we have also a sensory memory. And sensory memory is sometimes called the memory of our senses, because every information we gain from the outer world, everything we see, everything we hear, and so on, everything we taste, all of those is kept in our sensory memory. For a really short time, it's about milliseconds. I mean, it's not even seconds, it's milliseconds. After that, as the information is stored in the sensory memory, attention turns on. And once the attention is on, some parts of this information from sensory memory are transferred into short-term memory to be operated. All the information that we're not paying attention to is just completely lost. So for a really short period of time, we kind of remember everything what we've ever seen or heard in the very moment, but we very quickly forget it. Then the short-term memory. So here we have all the information we've paid attention to, And short-term memory is a type of memory that we use to operate information. So for example, if you're trying to call a friend and you're just typing his phone number, so you keep it in your mind, you have a look at it, you keep it in your mind, and then you just type it on your smartphone. That's how we use short-term memory. We use it to operate some pieces of information. And then we have long-term memory. So your guesses in the chat for how long can we keep information in the long-term memory. So once we're talking about sensory memory, it's milliseconds. Once we're talking about short-term memory, it's estimated to minutes to probably a couple of hours. I mean, that depends on classification. But how about long-term memory? For how long do you think we can keep information there? What's really important also to point on while you're typing your guesses in the chat is a process of consolidation. So consolidation, I believe you remember that from several slides before. Consolidation is the whole process of transferring information from short-term memory into the long-term memory. So that's really a process. It takes quite some time. The lowest estimation is about 4 or even sometimes 6 or 8 hours. That's how long it takes to transfer information from short-term memory to long-term memory. But yes, I can see an absolutely accurate guess in the chat that information in the long-term memory is stored there forever. So once we have successfully transferred the information from short-term memory into long-term memory, we have it here. The whole problem is about recalling. So I really like here this metaphor of long-term memory as a huge library where every memory is a book. So once you have a new memory, you just put it somewhere on any shelf in this mental library of yours, and you have no clues how to find this book. So our long-term memory is a really messy library with a lot of memories in there, but so little clues on where each memory lies. So that's exactly why we remember a lot of information. And as you remember, we have unlimited capacity. So we can remember as much information as we want, but we really have problems with recalling it if we don't use it. So we know for sure how to recall the information that we're using, but we totally forget how and where to find the information we haven't used for pretty much a while. If we're talking about differences in saving different types of information, the important thing here is so-called chunks. So you can see this word here on the slide. Chunk is the very way we organize information in our short-term memory before it's transferred into the long-term memory. So chunk is a piece of information because we can't really remember a bunch of information as a whole piece. We have to divide it, we have to split it in different chunks, and we do remember information in chunks. So once we're talking about numbers or words, we usually group them differently. So it's easier for us to group several words in one sentence, and this is going to be our chunk, one chunk that we can remember and transfer from short-term memory into the long-term memory. But once we're talking about numbers, it may be really much trickier to put as many numbers in one chunk as we've just done with words. So in this case, the chunking may be different for different types of information. And due to that, it might be trickier to remember some information just because it's harder to put it in different chunks. So that's how it works. And the really good news here is that we mostly can improve our ability to remember anything, especially by the way we put information in those chunks. So I'm pretty sure you've heard about various memory improving games. And I just have to say here that unfortunately, they're not really working. So if you've ever seen any kind of game that promised is going to improve your memory, the most probable outcome is that you'll just learn to do the very thing this game taught you. Like if you had the game when you have to remember numbers, you will become really good at remembering numbers. and that's just it. It won't affect a whole ability to remember information. So memory games is not the way we want to improve our memory, at least for now. I mean, who knows, probably all those memory games industry will have a huge grow in the nearest future, and probably will find out some ways to improve memory about games. But for now, it's not that effective. So what we can do? We can use various mnemotechniques that allow us to group, to group information in chunks. So what I really love here, like my most favorite mnemotechniques. So the first one was proposed by Cicero. You can see this guy here. It's the so-called Loci or place mnemotechnique, which works in the following way. So you have a look at the list of concepts you have to remember. Probably it's a list of words. And you imagine some place. It really works well with some real place that you've ever visited. For example, your own flat or the street you really love to walk up and down. So you remember this place, you imagine that in your mind, and you put the ideas of the concepts you have to remember in this very place. So if you, for example, have a list of what to buy in the shop, like a grocery list, you can imagine the streets you often walk up and down, and you imagine all those items from your grocery list in this way. So once you have to remember all of that, you'll just walk down your imaginary street and you have a look at what you've put there. So that's how this mnemotechnique works. And you can use it with any concepts, especially if you have to keep in mind not just the idea of the concept, like the meaning of it, but for example, a list of concepts or several ideas that have to be grouped together. So this is where this mnemotechnique is really useful. And another mnemotechnique I really love to show. It doesn't have a really special name, but the whole idea is about remembering a really long line of numbers. So what we have here is a list of numbers. It's really tricky and pretty hard to remember it because it's really long. But what we can do here, we can see the pattern here and split this whole list into just 2 dates. And it's so much easier for us to remember dates because they have more meaning than just numbers that have no meaning at all. So in here, these numbers are split into 2 pretty important dates. So I'm pretty sure you can all guess what happened on so-called 9/11, but probably someone also knows what happens on this date, like July 12th, 1941. I mean, it's kind of an important step in American history. So this specific example, as you can see, is important for American history in general. So if anyone guesses like what this date is all about, probably without Googling, I mean, it would be better. I would find a way to somehow congratulate you on that and give a small online present. Yeah, that's Pearl Harbor. Wow. I'll really have to think over how to congratulate on that, but I will figure something out. Yeah, that's Pearl Harbor. Wow, that's great. I'm super impressed. I feel like no one reacted so fast before. So that's the whole idea of this mnemotechnique. If you have to remember a really long line of numbers, you don't have to remember that as a line of numbers. You can try to find some meaning in there. This could be dates. This could be some important number sequences that make some meaning for you. I mean, you're the one who's trying to remember it. So it doesn't really matter what other people think about it. You're just splitting it in chunks that are suitable for yourself. And just wrapping it up, I want to tell you about the guy whose name is Joshua Foer. And he's the author of the book that was mentioned in the chat sometime before. So this guy is a really inspirational example. So he's a journalist, and once he was sent to cover and write an article about some memory championship where a lot of guys just gathered together and tried to beat each other in who would remember more information of some specific type. And Joshua became so into the topic that not only he wrote the article about it, but also he spent the following year training his memory, learning various mnemotechniques, and the very next year he came back to this memory championship as one of the participants and hit a world record in just 1 year of a pretty hard training. But I really feel like this example is super inspirational because that's how it works. If you put some effort into improving your memory, if you learn how to use mnemotechniques, if you start using them, that's a really great improvement in how you remember information. So our memory, of course, isn't perfect. It's not ideal, but we can totally boost it just by using mnemotechniques and just by putting extra attention into how specifically we put information in chunks, how we group information, and how we remember it. So yeah, that's actually it. So have you got any questions? You can just like start putting them in chat. I'm sure there are some questions that I save for the end of the lecture, so I'll just scroll the whole chat. And also, I would really love to share with you some book and reading recommendations about memory, because half an hour is for sure a really short time frame for a lecture, so I just covered the whole basics. So I would totally recommend to read Lure's book about Cheryshev. It's for sure translated in English. It's a super popular book and it's really little. It's like 100 pages. Also, there's Joshua Foer's book, Moonwalking with Einstein. It's a bunch of mnemotechniques, and you can use this book as a good start if you want to use mnemotechniques. And there's like a list of them with pretty full description on how to use it. So that's a really good start. Also, if you're interested in childhood memories and in some kind of memory implantation, I would totally recommend to watch Elizabeth Loftus' lecture on TED conference. And if you want some kind of extra materials, some of them are in Russian, some of them are in English, but I have a special playlist on YouTube that you can access using this link. And there you can find some extra information about memory. So I will just quickly roll to the last slide with the link to my book on memory improvement and my social networks. If you for some reason want to have a closer look on my Instagram or some other social networks. So I will just quickly paste in the chat all those links because I realize that you can't really copy them from the way you see them in Zoom. So I'll just quickly copy paste it and then move on to all the questions. And thank you so much for just copying them again, because it makes so much easier for me just finding them. Okay, so that's it. What about memorizing names? So about memorizing names, the whole problem here is to make a really strong association bond between the person, his face, and his name. So in this case, the most working technique is just keep using it. So you meet a new guy, he says, "Hi, my name is," and firstly, you put attention to that. I mean, so many people just don't put enough attention on what person's name, so they just forget it because they didn't care really. So firstly, you focus on that, like, okay, this guy's name is, and then you just try to use his name several times while you're talking to him or her. And because of several repetitions, it's becoming easier for you to associate this specific person's look with his or her name. About forgetting bad memories. It's really hard for us to forget something that we have focused on. And unfortunately, bad memories that cause some kind of emotional pain usually, we unfortunately are focused on them. So we pay attention to them. And because of our paying attention, we can't really forget them. So the more you think about something, the harder it is to forget something. That's why all those Hollywood script writers try to invent some kind of memory wiping machines. And that would be great, probably. I mean, there are pros and cons. But unfortunately, for now, we have no kind of technique that would allow us to really forget bad memory. And that's exactly why time heals, because time passes on. So you don't really focus that much on that specific bad memory, and it just shades away. So I'm going down the chat. About Kahneman's book. It's mostly the book about thinking, as it clearly says in the book title. So it's not really about remembering information. But yeah, that's a really good must read on how we operate various concepts. Thank you for the link. Yeah, I really love some comic book sketches, as you may have noticed from my presentation. So the question about mnemotechniques. Can mnemotechniques work for people who face memory problems like dementia, or could they press these persons more and have the opposite result? They could work. So not diving really deep into the details, because there's several types of dementias and they're so different actually, I mean, from the clinical perspective. But in general, once we're talking about dementias, the whole problem is both on the remember information and on recalling information. And mnemotechniques are really helpful here because they help the person to group the information in chunks and remember those chunks. And then it's easier to recall information grouped in chunks. So yes, mnemotechniques are really useful, no matter what kind of memory problems the person has. Probably the only problem when mnemotechniques won't work is anterograde amnesia, when the person has no possibility to remember information due to some brain damage. In all the other cases, mnemotechniques are pretty useful. So yeah, I don't see any kind of new questions in the chat. So probably let's do a last question thing. Okay, I see. Yes, I do use some mnemotechniques. Not all of them for sure, but yes, I do some. That's a really funny thing about favorite movies about memory. I don't have one, which is a little bit insane, but I don't have one because every time I watch a Hollywood film about memory, I feel like one of those doctors who is watching some series about doctors. Like, I'm so frustrated with the very way that it's not the way memory works. So I don't really have a favorite one. But probably I finally should have a look at all of them and I don't know, think it over. But actually what I really love about all those films on memory, there's a special course on Coursera. It's like 5 weeks long or something. And there a memory professor just watches Hollywood films and movies on memory. And he just describes what's wrong here, what's wrong there. And that's a whole course on Coursera. Wow, that was a rhyme. Cool. So yeah, it's really funny here with memory movies, but most of them are not describing the life as it really is.
So thank you, Polina. Thank you for your lecture. Actually, I heard it like 3 times in Russian before, but I still enjoyed it so much, and I will definitely would like to hear it again. So thank you guys for joining us, for your questions. We will also publish the recording of this lecture on our YouTube channel. I've sent a link the chat, and also we will make a post on our broadcast. And also I've sent a link to an Instagram about Ig Nobel Prize, one of Polina's projects. I really enjoyed because we talk a lot about Nobel Prize winners here on the Economics Olympiad, about Nobel Prize winners in economics, but it's very interesting to look to it from another side too, so I totally recommend you it. And thank you, Polina, for your time, for your lecture. So goodbye.
Yeah, it was really nice sharing some information about memory with you. I hope it's going to be helpful, so fingers crossed. I don't know how it's going with all the results, and I don't know at what stage are you already. Like, are you just waiting for the results, and do you have some other competitions to come by? But I'm pretty sure that all these memory life hacks could be useful. So have a nice day.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, guys. Goodbye.